We turn today to Cantos 18 to 23, and in fact, within this lesson, we'll be completing the remaining cantos all the way until Dante reaches the final culminating point of hell in the 33rd and 34th canto. And at this point, he arrives at circle 8 in Malbolge, which are these this circle with these ditches, and the ditches are symbolizing baptismal fonts. So just as in baptism we're being baptized by the Holy Spirit and raised into the kingdom of heaven, so in Malbolge the evil sinners are being baptized in their suffering. So circles 8 to 9 both involve are punishments for sinners who commit fraud or betray trust in some way. Circle 8 is for those who commit simple fraud, that is, fraud against one's neighbor. And circle 9 are those who commit compound fraud, that is, fraud against a friend or family member. So circle 8 is separated into ditches, as I've noticed, in fact, into 10 different ditches. And we'll be getting through all these ditches and looking at the various punishments that each of the sinners receive. So we have here ditch 1, where we encounter the seducers and the pimps, basically, for example, prostitutes and those who use prostitutes. And what we see is that they are eternally whipped by these horned demons. So it's a rather nasty scene that he runs into, and more demons are encountered. And in fact, as we get into these sections, these circles, the 8th and the 9th, we see what amounts to the typical depiction of the demon of hell, in the sense of the individual with the wings and the kind of the horns, etc. Whereas in earlier circles of hell, we saw more of the kind of symbolic representation of evil through various monstrosities, such as the Minotaur, etc. So here we see more of that classical sense of what the demon would be like. And within this ditch, he encounters Jason of the Argonauts. Okay, he's a tall figure who stands out amidst the damned and doesn't show any real signs of suffering. So here again we see a figure who is almost kind of indifferent to the sufferings of hell, and this Dante wants to use to represent kind of the certain nobility. And it is a kind of interesting thing how he does that, how certain noble individuals within the classical poetic and literary tradition are represented, or even patriots, as we saw with Farinata, who rose from the tomb, are represented in this way as kind of indifferent to the suffering. And it kind of goes contrary to the very idea of being lost. Even these souls, being mortal, would be lost, but this is not how Dante represents them. And we have the tale of the Argonauts. Jason of the Argonauts sails the ship Argos in search of the golden fleece in order to retain his principality, and it's a symbol of authority and kingship, and as I said, to establish the position of king of Thessaly. And unfortunately, he had a habit of kind of seducing women and leaving them. And in one instance, Medea, a sorceress, she actually helps him to obtain the fleece, and he marries her. They fall in love. He later leaves her for another woman. This wasn't the first time he's done this. And she venges him by murdering their 2 children. And this is depicted in Euripides' Medea. And so it's another terrible tragedy, wonderful tragedy in the sense that it's brilliantly composed. And so we see here that he commits this abandons this treachery that he commits on Medea. And for this reason, he's committed to this ditch. He moves into the second ditch, the flatterers, who live in this nasty situation where they're wallowing in a swamp of human excrement. So it's a rather nasty way to be punished, although at the same time one could say that the punishment is not necessarily as bad as some of the others have received, in the sense that they're just wallowing in it, but they're not really being physically punished in any other way. We have the third ditch, okay, and this ditch we'll have to talk about a bit more thoroughly because he encounters a number of individuals. It's the Simonists, the Simonists, and the Simonists are buried upside down, and heat scorches the soles of their feet. You should understand that some of these depictions here are renditions of actual or depictions of actual torture practices that were done during the medieval times, the Middle Ages, practices in which you'd hold a person down and they'd tie their feet and then burn the soles of their feet while you have an inquisitor who's asking them questions and trying to get them to confess to heresy or to some other form of crime, even if the individual has not committed it, and of course, eventually you'll get the confession. Now, simony comes from the biblical tradition, in fact, from the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, and the Simon the Magos, Simon the magician. He's a sorcerer who attempts to kind of buy the kingdom of heaven. He attempts to purchase power of the Holy Spirit. He sees the apostles with these various abilities on account of their being baptized by the Holy Spirit and the Holy Spirit descending upon the apostles. And he offers money to them, saying, "Give me also this ability so that everyone on whom I may lay my hands will receive the Holy Spirit." And he offers money, in fact, with this offer. And Peter says, "Well, may your money perish with you because you thought you could buy the gift of God with money. You have no part or share in this ministry because your heart is not right before God." So simony originates from this sorcerer then, and later on in the church, what happens is that some of the upper tier bishops, etc., start to sell church offices. You can kind of think of it as attempting within the U.S. government to sell a Senate seat so that someone who purchases it can now get that seat. So they would actually sell these positions. Somebody would either die or move out of a position, and then they sell the position. And this became, in fact, a widespread corrupt practice and corruption of the church. And so certain measures had to be taken to crack down on this. There he encounters, among the Simonists, Pope Nicholas III. So here we have a pope now that Dante casts into the flames of hell. So notice that there's some very deep political ramifications of doing that, since the church of his time is a political power, and Dante is here saying, well, look, Pope Nicholas is in hell, in fact. So this certainly represents a certain standpoint, and from his political view, and due to the political tensions going on during that time in Italy and especially in Florence. So his feet burn more intensely with the heat. Now initially he mistakes him for Pope Boniface VIII, who was responsible for Dante's eventual exile. And interestingly, Nicholas mistakes Dante for Boniface, so there's a kind of double kind of illusion or deception here. And he foretells the damnation. This is very interesting. He foretells the damnation of the still living Boniface. So here's Dante saying that when a pope who's still living is going to be damned. Nicholas, that is Pope Nicholas, also practiced nepotism. And that comes from the Italian nipote. In other words, it's the act of appointing relatives to political positions. And in his case, he appointed 3 such relatives to the cardinalship and to other types of positions. And so this was also another problem during that time, which was called lay investiture. And lay investiture meant that you would take a lay person, a person who is not a religious order, for example, not a priest, etc., and they would make that person a priest, and then they would give that person, here's nepotism, a position such as make that person the cardinal. So this became another practice that the church would have to eventually crack down upon, and indeed some of these practices would lead to, for example, the Reformation, a Protestant Reformation started by Martin Luther, where we have this schism, this separation of the old Christian medieval church, the Catholic Church, Catholicos meaning universal, into various parts, where we have then the Protestant Church. And a lot of this originates because of these practices, and certainly in opposition to them. So we get to ditch 4, here the seers and the sorcerers. And here you see a depiction of them. Their heads are reversed and their eyes are blinded by tears. And you could kind of see the contrapasso within their punishment because, well, within actual the living life, they attempted to foresee the future, and now in the dead, although they foresee the future, they are physically blinded now and their heads are reversed. Well, they're blinded by their tears, that is. And then we get into one of the more memorable scenes, that of the grafters. And this scene represents, in fact, it's one of the longest scenes, and here's a little depiction of it. We see Dante, perhaps Dante, or at least some of the souls around this sort of pot, and we see these demons around the pot with these spears, with these hooks on them, and they hook these individuals in this boiling pitch, and they're tossed in there, and they tear the flesh. So it's a rather nasty scene, and in fact the demons that surround it are rather nasty themselves. Now, the grafters here, just so you know, it refers to someone who commits extortion or blackmail. And as they approach this ditch, they encountered these 12 evil demons called the malebranche, the evil claws. And as I said, the grafters are in this boiling pitch. As they surface, the demon grabs them with the hook and tears the flesh. Here the allusion is to cooking and to tearing meat. Interestingly, the names of the demons have this sort of slight alteration to it, but they're actually derived from these Florentine leaders who Dante evidently opposed. So here again, Dante starts to fear for his life. We saw this earlier when he approached the city of Dis and the angels rained down and they brought out the Furies and the Medusa. Well, here he feels a similar fear because the Malebranche, the evil claws, are rather nasty and unruly demons that don't seem to want to listen to Virgil. And one of them, the leader of them, Malacoda, the evil tale, in fact lies to Virgil directly. So we see, of course, that the damned angels, the fallen angels, and of course Satan is known as the father of lies, and the angels themselves are liars. So they say that the bridge to the next section has collapsed. This is a lie, and they do this as a ruse to get them. So they say, hey, well, I'll escort you guys with 10 demons, these 10 nasty demons who are harassing and lunging their spears or their pitchforks at him. And so eventually they discover that lie, and rather angrily. But anyhow, we see this instance of lying. So within this section, a man pops out of the boiling pitch, who is referred to only as the Navarace. And this is a kind of interesting instance within the book that shows Dante's brilliance in depicting scenes, especially visually, and just the kind of the happiness and the joy of these demons, the evil kind of joy that they get from torturing this individual is well depicted by Dante. But eventually he's able to escape, so they have him by their hooks, by offering a ruse, and he says basically, look, there's a few others under here, and I can bring them up for you. And they say, okay, and they let him out, and he slides back in underneath the boiling pitch. So interestingly, it's better to be beneath this boiling pitch, which is basically like tar, boiling tar, than it is to be up there in the hooks of these demons. They move on to the hypocrites, and the hypocrites we see here are weighed down by these heavy robes of lead. So we see in life that the hypocrites led basically two types of lives. They preached one thing and they did another, and here obviously that contradiction is represented in being weighed down by these leaden robes. There they encounter Caiaphas, who is depicted in the New Testament. He was the Jewish high priest, and he counseled the Pharisees to crucify Jesus. And he says, why? Because it's expedient, in other words, it's better that one man should die for the people. And here you see him depicted, and as Christ who is crucified, so here in hell, he receives a special punishment compared to the other individuals who wear the leaden robes, the hypocrites, and he is crucified to the floor along with others of the Jewish high priests. You should note here that the Jews during Dante's time were not very well accepted and not very well treated. For example, they didn't receive citizenship. They were forced often, in most cases, to live in ghettos. They were allowed to lend money at interest, and this was forbidden among the Christians. The Jews were allowed to do this because they were not Christian, but of course they received a bad name and the ill will of the majority Christians because they demanded the interest and the payment back, and of course they could take you to court if you didn't. An instance of this is shown in Shakespeare. Shakespeare, of course, comes around a bit later during the Renaissance, and in his The Merchant of Venice we see that we have the case of a Jewish merchant who lends money to a once wealthy nobleman who can't repay it, and then demands a pound of flesh in repayment if he doesn't make his payments on time. And I think the story is exemplary because it shows just how the Jews were depicted in that time, because we see that this particular merchant within Shakespeare is depicted as a rather loathsome individual, sort of a vicious person, of very negative character, and this is kind of the depiction of the Jews. And here in hell we see that the Jewish high priest receives this very terrible punishment. Now we move on to Cantos 24 to 30, and into ditch 7, where we have the thieves. And we see them, they're being harassed by these snakes, you'll notice. This is also a memorable scene from the Inferno. So they're punished by these snakes, and the snakes sort of coil around them, and they bind their hands behind their backs. They also fly through the air, these snakes. This is a really interesting picture that Dante conceives in his imagination. They pierce the jugular, the throat of the thieves, and thieves are then burst into ashes, and like the phoenix, they are reborn again. So here's the sort of the symbolic idea of the retribution here, the contrapasso. The snakes, like snakes, the thieves are sneaky, right, and treacherous. Their hands are bound behind their back because, well, thieves use their hands to steal, and so the very hands that are used for this purpose are within eternity and damnation, bound behind the back, and become useless to them, especially in their ability, for example, to fight off the snakes. They burst into ash, and the idea here, it seems, is that as they steal the substance, for example, the wealth from others and goods from others, so in hell the substance is stolen and taken from them. But of course they are reconstituted, reborn, because all the souls, even as they're destroyed, are brought back into that soul which becomes indestructible and wants to gather a body about itself, in this case the body of air. And there they see Vanni Fucci. He's in fact one of the thieves that bursts and then is reborn. He was a black Guelph from Pistia, and he stole some relics, holy objects, from a chapel, after which he's betrayed by his partner and accomplice. Sorry, he betrayed his partner and accomplice. He was also a violent man, but violence would be placed at a higher circle in hell. Since he betrayed his partner, he's lower in hell, in the 8th circle of hell, you see. So Vanni Fucci prophesizes the exile of the white girls from Florence. So of course we see that Dante is here placing this ability to prophecy and within the souls of the damned, and in doing so he relates to present events going on and possible future events within Florence. He then curses God, and by placing his thumb between his two fingers, this is kind of like giving the middle finger in our own times, and it was a sign of copulation, which kind of it's similar today when we emphasize the expletive in relation to the sign itself. After this, Cacus comes in a rage after Vanni Fucci, and Cacus is the centaur who has these snakes. He's covered with snakes, and there's a fire-breathing dragon sort of perched on his head. He chases after Vanni to punish him. Now, this comes from Virgil, who portrays him as a man-dragon. You see that? Who steals the cattle of Hercules. Here he's not a man-dragon, he's a centaur with a dragon on his head. And after stealing, in Virgil's story, the cattle of Hercules, Hercules hears the cries and he strangles Cacus, and here he is in hell. So another of the descriptions that Dante gives is that the souls are transformed with the snakes, the serpents. So what happens is not only do they coil around them, or they shoot themselves into the necks and burst them into ash, but also they intertwine with the body. They swallow the body of the thieves, and they become one with the thieves into these monstrous combinations. And this becomes a kind of anti-representation of what's called the incarnation of Christ, where Christ, who is of two natures, because he is both human, fully human, he's a complete human being, and he's fully divine because he's God, intertwines to become one person in what's called the incarnation. Now, the origin of the incarnation, of course, comes from biblical history and theology, but the basic idea, we can understand it as, well, the human being within the Garden of Eden commits sin and falls from the grace of God, is destined to mortality and death. The human being is finite, completely finite, and we are a combination of form and matter, and so as material we have this part of us which makes us even more finite. God and the Father is completely infinite. And so we have this opposition between God as completely infinite and the human being as finite. And there's no intermediary between the two. Now, this notion of the finite, the infinite, and the need for an intermediary actually finds origins in ancient thought, and especially in something Neoplatonic thought, what's called, the type of philosophy that comes out of the age during the early Roman age, around 200 AD, especially 300 AD. That's probably more like the Middle Roman age. But in any case, it sort of works its way into Christian theology. And so the idea is that Christ becomes a human being, so Christ is eternally with God, as God, but eventually God makes the decision that Christ should serve as an intermediary, and so God becomes human in order to become an intermediary, because now you have God who is both human, is divine, infinite, and human, finite, in one nature. And so as human, God, who is both human and divine, can now mediate the divide between the finite and the infinite, and so the human being can be brought back into some form of union with the infinite, but this can only occur through Christ. And so for this reason we see that salvation arises only through Christ, and there can be no salvation outside of Christ, because one obtains no intermediary except through Christ. So we see this kind of anti-transformation in hell, where we have this kind of incarnation of the person and this serpent of hell, and it becomes a nasty new kind of anti-Christ combination. So we move on to the evil counselors in Ditch 8. The evil counselors, those who gave bad advice leading to harmful results, As in life they work in secret and they use their gifts of God for evil work, so in death they are hidden behind walls of flame. So they're in this secret, dark place behind flames, and it sort of depicts the secrecy of their acts and also the flames of conscience, right? Just as the opportunists at the entrance to hell are pursued by bees, which is their conscience, so the flames of hell bite at the conscience of those who give bad counsel. Well, this is a very interesting scene for the reason that we encounter a character who we are very familiar with, and that is Ulysses. This is the Latinized name of Odysseus, the great hero of Homer's novel, the Odyssey. Well, this is interesting. Why is he in hell? So the two Greek heroes, Ulysses and Diomedes, are actually sealed in flames together. Okay, Ulysses, as I said, is the Latinized version of Odysseus, and Diomedes is the Greek hero of a Trojan War. Why? Why are they both here? So they're both sealed within the single tomb or wall of flame. They're both blamed for 3 offenses. Interestingly, these offenses are the offenses of metis. So in other words, the very virtues that are praised in ancient times for these heroes now become vices within the context of Christian morality. So we have the virtues of cunning, of deception, okay, of being able to mislead and overcome, right, and being able to overthrow one's foe. Now these become certain kinds of vices. So they're blamed for these offenses. What offenses were those? The stratagem of the wooden horse. In other words, they used the wooden horse to deceive the Trojans. Of course, this was used as a deceptive purpose in war. But in any case, also they lured Achilles, the great hero of Troy, into the Trojan War. Initially, he wasn't going to go, and they actually, Odysseus, especially Ulysses, helped to convince him. And his mother, who was a nymph, a kind of deity, a goddess, Thetis, warned him, and she said to Achilles, "You have 2 choices. You can remain here as king in his island, or you can, and if you do so, you will live a long and happy life, or you can go to the Trojan War, and there you will die, but your name will live on eternally." And of course, we know what choice Achilles made, and of course, Ulysses or Odysseus and Diomedes helped him to make the choice of going to the war because, well, they just needed the great Achilles to do this. Later on, they steal the Palladium, which is this statue of Athena from Troy, and it was the statue which was a kind of protector of Troy. Once they do so now, the Trojans become open and vulnerable, which would eventually lead to their defeat through a ruse, of course. So we see here that Ulysses and Diomedes, they're treacherous. They give evil counsels. They know how to lie, and they're deceptive. We knew this all along when we read the Odyssey, and here he's really condemned for it. Interestingly, afterwards, Dante gives a story of how Odysseus died, how Ulysses died. He invents the story. And he says basically he got home, and after reclaiming his house and killing the suitors, he just got bored as he was getting old, which kind of makes sense. I mean, the man was on the sea for 20 years, and now he's sitting at home with nothing to do. You'd actually imagine that he'd be happy to be home and just want to stay there. I imagine that would be what I would want to do. But no, he gets bored, and he takes another voyage into unknown territory, and he gets into a shipwreck, and he dies. So he dies a kind of Odyssean death, as we see, according to Dante. This is all made up by Dante, in fact, which most of the stories, of course, are all sort of fiction, based upon possible real-life persons. They also encounter another soul, Guido de Montefeltro, who speaks to Dante, thinking Dante will never leave hell. So remember, this is an important theme here, that the souls don't think that Dante will ever leave and reveal the fact that they have been entombed or sent into hell and damned for eternity. So you see, Dante is really concerned here with what we saw in the ancient text of Kleos, a good name. And you can imagine that for Dante even in the medieval times, this is a very important thing to have and to keep as represented by the souls, because they're so concerned, even in hell, of their good name being tarnished, saying, oh, look, Guido's in hell, Dante told me. So, and he says, if I thought my answer was to someone who might return to the world, so he doesn't think Dante will, this flame would move no more. In other words, he wouldn't speak. But since from this depth it never happened that anyone alive returned, in other words, no one has ever returned from hell, and he's not quite right, if I hear right, without fear of infamy, so in other words, a bad name, I'll answer you. So he kind of, Dante tricks him a little. Now, T.S. Eliot, okay, the great writer and poet, uses the lines in his epigraph to his poem of the modern-day Guido, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. So it's just a little interesting side note there. And in Dante, Guido was kind of a Odyssean, like Ulysses, warrior, sly warrior who uses metis to charm his ways about the world and to deceive. He tried to repent from this, though. And Pope Boniface, who of course is prophesied to damn, asked for advice for how to destroy his enemies from Guido, and Guido relents and gives him the terrible advice to make promises but don't keep them. And so in death, an angel comes to take Guido into heaven, but the devil intercedes in a bad way and claims his soul instead. So a sort of terrible end to a man who tried to turn back from his ways, but in the end, the very end, fell into evil ways once again. So it's kind of warning that even if we're on the right path now, we have to be careful lest we fall into bad ways by becoming careless within the future. He approaches ditch 9, the sowers of discord. In other words, they're the schismatics. A schism means to cleave in half, to split in half. And the sowers of discord, you generally understood in terms of a division, religious division, but not only. They can sow discord between family members, between friends, between kings, between individuals who make pacts, okay, and form treaties. So they're anybody who forms a type of schism. But schism usually is understood as a division in faith. So we saw the schism between, for example, I spoke earlier, between the early medieval church and later the Protestant Reformation, which caused a schism within the unity of the church. In this case, the schismatics are punished in a very nasty way. They line up and move around the ditch in the circle, and there a great demon sits with a sword, and they approach the demon, and he hacks them in half with the sword, or runs them through with the sword, and then they're reconstituted as they move around the ditch, only to be hacked again or cleaved by that demon, and this continues for all eternity. And who does he encounter within this ditch? None other but Mohammed, the great leader and founder of Islam. He also encounters his brother, Ali. And whereas Muhammad's body is split from the groin to the chin, Ali's face is cleft from top to bottom here. So here we have a picture of Muhammad. So you should take note of the fact that during this time, the Christians and the Muslims are deeply at opposition with one another. The Christian armies are at the time fighting with little success at that time and heavy loss to drive out the Muslims who are occupying the Holy Land, that is Jerusalem and surrounding areas of Israel that we'd see today, certain parts. These wars, of course, are still in Dante's mind, and so Islam is seen as very hostile. We know, if you recall, when Dante approached the city of Dis while he was being transported on the boat and got off and the angels flew down, Dis is depicted as having these high towers that look like mosques. So the mosques here are, so obviously Islam is depicted as a kind of a very deeply anti-Christian, antichrist religion, and Muhammad is here depicted as a schismatic because he creates a division within the church that would pray to God, the Christian church, and creates a new church, which is, in this case, obedient to Allah, but not to Christ. Um, Thereafter, he encounters Bertrand de Born, so another poet, and in this case he was a troubadour, kind of a traveling poet like Homer, who caused a rift between King Henry II, so you see a schism of England and his son, and for this reason he carries his own head, having been decapitated by that demon. Here's an excerpt from his poems. Maces, swords, helmets colorfully, shields slicing and smashing, we'll see at the start of the melee, with all those vassals clashing, and horses running free, from their masters hit down tread. Once the charge has been led, every man of nobility will hack at arms and heads. Here he carries his own head. Better than taken prisoner, be dead. So it's very interesting how the poem here sort of contrasts and sort of resembles in its words his own fate. We get to the final ditch of this circle, and the falsifiers, that is, those who present the imitation as real, the appearance of things as though it's reality. And we get four classes here: the alchemists, who falsify metals; the impersonators, who falsify identity; the counterfeiters, who falsify money, kind of similar to the alchemists, not exactly the same; and liars, who falsify truth. And they have various punishments. Some are zombies that pursue others and eat them, so kind of early depiction of zombies here. And somehow are bloated by diseases and various afflictions of the skin or the body, and so there's all these different punishments depending upon the type of falsification that was committed. There they see two other souls, Master Adam and Sinon the Greek. So one is a counterfeiter, the other a liar. One's a 13th century Englishman, another a figure from the Trojan War. And Master Adam here, he manufactured counterfeit florins, basically the coin of Florence. So he manufactured money and sold it as though it were real, counterfeit money. The other one deceived the Trojans, telling them he escaped the Greeks, and he also tells the Greeks left the wooden horse as a gift, so he was the one to say that, oh look, the horse here was left as a gift for you, and so he deceives and becomes a liar to the Trojans, and so they're both here within this ditch of falsifiers. But notice here they're also at war with one another, and it shows that not only are the damned at war with God, but they are also at war with one another, and indeed the demons are at war with them. So there is only war, punishment, hate, and suffering in eternity. This is kind of the representation here. We turn now to the Cantos 31 to 34, the final cantos of Dante's Infernos, and what amounts to some of the most memorable scenes, especially the final encounter with Lucifer of the Inferno. He approaches now what amounts to a large well, the pit, in fact, of Malbolge, and which will lead down to the ninth and final circle, and there he sees these great giants chained, and they stand between the 8th and the ninth circles. Well, what we have here are in fact the titans and the giants foretold with it by Homer and by the great mythology, by the mythology of the ancient Greeks, the titans who were overthrown and the giants overthrown by the Olympian gods, tossed into Tartarus and chained there, and here they are in Dante's Inferno at the very between the 8th and the ninth circle of hell. As I've noted before, the giants or the titans rebelled against the gods, and they are eventually thrown into the pit, and of course they symbolize everything that is proudful and bestial, especially bestial in human nature. So some of the different titans or giants that he encounters, one is Nimrod, who actually arises from also biblical tradition. He's called in Genesis, for example, a stout hunter before the Lord, and he attempted to construct a great tower to reach all the way up to the heavens, kind of like the towers we see in our cities today, which is called the Tower of Babylon. and God was not very happy with this. And of course, as the city sought to bring unity to humanity through its own proud rejection of God, so God is displeased and scatters the people and destroys the unity of their language. Now Nimrod here, he speaks a language only he can understand, so this it sort of represents that scattering of the language of Babylon. Some of the other giants, Ephialtes, attempted to scale Mount Olympus. It was shot down by Apollo's arrows. We have Briareos, who Virgil describes as having 100 arms, sort of this great monster, and breathing fire in war against the gods. We have Tityus, who attempted to rape Latona. We saw this in the Odyssey, and the vulture eats his liver in Homer. And we have Typhon, who was struck down by Zeus's lightning and buried beneath Mount Etna. So Mount Etna in Sicily. So I've actually been down there some years ago, in fact. It's very interesting. If you travel from Italy, you can travel from train, and the train and the train will actually get on a boat and cross over a boat to get to Sicily, which is an island located quite close. The train gets on the boat brings you to Sicily, and as you're on the train and riding along the train, you can see Mount Etna, and you see that it still smokes to this day, the volcano, and the tremors that it causes were attributed in ancient times to Typhon, who was buried beneath Mount Etna. We have Antaeus as well, who is unfettered. Okay, he's born after the war, in fact, so he's just cast down there. And in this case, he's able to take Dante, to lift him up and lower him to the 9th floor of hell. And here's that depiction, a picture from William Blake, the poet and writer, and painter, in fact. So we finally reach the 9th circle of hell, which is the last 3 cantos here, the 4th canto representing their exit. And we encounter compound fraud, which is treachery against persons that are specially tied to us. Here we encounter 4 types. The first round is Cana, traitors to kin, and the Cana comes from Cain, from the Genesis, the Old Testament, who murdered his brother Abel. The second round is Antenora, who are traitors to their country. Antenor, he was a Trojan prince who helped the Greeks, in fact. We have the third round is the Ptolemaea, who are traitors to their guests or hosts. And here, this comes from Ptolemy, who was a captain of Jericho. He was invited, then murdered his father-in-law, high priest Simon Maccabee, at a feast. So, real traitorous, treacherous individual. And we see the fourth round is the Judeca from Judas, and they're traitors to their masters, just as Judas, the disciple, betrayed Christ. And there they encounter a great frozen lake. The soul's frozen. It's very interesting, you'll notice, because you see the upper levels of hell are represented as fiery, but as we get to the lower levels of hell, we see it's represented by cold and emptiness. And this serves as a depiction of what we saw, the chain of being. The chain of being, God is at the top, and at the bottom there's nothingness. And of course, if we see, as we move to the top, we have the fullness of being, and certainly heat represents some presence, whereas cold represents the absence. And so at the very absence at the bottom of hell, we move and proceed all the way to nothingness, so that even there is absence of heat and fire. And there they encounter a very nasty scene, Ugolino and Ruggieri, and we see that one of the men is eating the head of the other. So here's the Count and the Archbishop, and Count Ugolino and Archbishop Ruggieri participate in a series of betrayals. Ruggieri eventually betrays Ugolino, so they were working together. The one man betrayed the other, and the one who betrayed him seals him in a prison with his 4 sons and allows them no food. And so Ugolino must watch as each of his sons die, one after the other. And this is the scene he discusses to Dante. And finally he dies, and in hell they're frozen together. But Ugolino is behind Ruggieri, and so he's able to turn upon him, and he eats the back of his head and brains in this monstrous anger, and also the contrapasso, because he dies in hunger and famished. And there he also encounters Fra Alberigo in the Ptolemea, and he's from one of the ruling Guelph family. He became a jovial friar, which was an order of friars who were meant to restore the peace during the time, so there's some difficulties. But unfortunately, these friars became very corrupt, and a relative plotted against him. In revenge against this relative, he invited them and his son to a banquet. At the meal's end, he signals, "Bring the fruit," and armed servants slaughter the guests, just as Aegisthus, the suitor, rather the lover of Clytemnestra and wife of Agamemnon, slays Agamemnon at his own house and banquet hall. So we see that Fra Alberigo slays his own Manfred, his relative, in a similar way. So he discusses, interesting, the state of damnation in this case for those who betray their host. He says, when one betrays their host in this way, their soul is immediately stripped from their body while still living, and in place, the body is replaced with a demon. So we see that a demon possesses the body in this act. So in other words, the act brings with it immediate damnation. So there's no coming back from an act such as this. And so Dante conceives it as one of the nastiest acts, one of them, not the only, nastiest acts that one can commit. And it shows here the importance of hospitality, right? So which links us to the Odyssey, because the suitors, of course, infringed upon the hospitality of Odysseus and received a terrible fate for it. And so we see that Dante is kind of representing that in a similar way. Finally, we get to the famous Giudecca, and here's Lucifer depicted in this, and with the various souls around him. And there they see Lucifer, also Satan or Dis or Beelzebub, and he's the great angel, in fact, the light bearer, okay, one of the most beautiful angels, now become the ugliest. Now you should understand that in the story I told of the biblical scene where Christ is incarnated and becomes a human being so that he can mediate the finite human being and the infinite God, what happens is that when this occurs, okay, Satan, of course, gets wind of this. Even as God has the intention of creating the human being, Satan sees what's going to happen in this creation, that the human being will fall, but God will bring the human being back to himself by becoming a human being. Satan sees that God will become a human being, and he says, look, I can't worship a human being. That is, in fact, lesser than I, because, of course, Satan is one of the greatest of the angels, and he's he's not perfectly eternal because he's created, but he is, in some sense, he is an immortal creature, and he is of great intelligence, and so he refuses to serve God after that because he sees that God will become finite in ways through Christ, okay, as a mediator. And so this creates that kind of fall of the angels who rebel against God, just as kind of the Titans and the Olympians fought. So we see that we have the war between the fallen angels and the good angels and God, and they're tossed from heaven just as the Titans are tossed, and they end up in hell. So it's interesting to see the mythology here and some of the religious views coming together, and that we have these themes throughout the different Western religions, and that kind of all come together. In any case, Lucifer is not being once the most beautiful, is now the ugliest. He has 3 faces of different colors, symbolizing or representing the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And his size is colossal. In other words, if we consider it as a proportion, we see that as the giants were to Dante, so they were monstrous in size compared to him, So Lucifer is even much larger than the giants. So he's a great and colossal creature. And in his mouth, there are the three famous betrayers of their masters. There's first Brutus and Cassius, who famously betrayed Julius Caesar in his assassination. Now, Dante is, of course, angered by this because we see the Roman Empire, which became eventually the Christian Roman Empire through Constantine, Emperor Constantine, was essential to God's plan, and we see that it's eventually that these betrayers to it are seen as great betrayers of God's plan as well. And Caesar initially pardoned them even after siding with his opposition, the opposition side in General Pompey, but they betray him anyway. And finally, there's the great betrayal of Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 apostles of Christ, who betrays Christ for money and with a kiss. And as they have their feet first in the mouth of Satan, who gnaws on them, so Judas is head first in his mouth. The departure is a very odd scene. They climb down the hairy hide of Lucifer. Now you should notice that they're going through the middle of the earth, and so gravity is going to change such that as they approach the middle, they're going down, and then they pass the middle of the earth, and now they're going up, right? Because now gravity has changed, and once it was pushing them down, and now it's going the other way. And so they reach the other side of the earth, and Satan now appears upside down, which represents, of course, he's the anti-Christ in a way. He's opposed to Christ, so he's upside down. But also, it shows kind of his fall from heaven. Just as the Titans fell, he falls head first and is plowed beneath the earth, and so is upside down. So you notice the mastery use of symbols of Dante, which shows really in developing the Inferno, he must have spent much time in developing these complex themes and ideas before he actually even sat down to write the work. There is the final exit from hell. They leave hell and they see the stars. Interesting, the word stella, which means star, sits at the end of each book. This kind of, I guess this serves as a kind of poetic, adds a poetic touch to the end of each book. And after this, they must ascend Mount Purgatory, and thereafter they must ascend heaven. Now what happens is Virgil will lead Dante through some of Purgatory, but at some point he is unable, and so at that point Beatrice, his muse, the woman who he had been enamored with, who had died, will come to lead him through Purgatory and eventually up through heaven, thus ending the Divine Comedy. And I would really recommend that all of you who have passed through the Inferno not pass through the rest of your lives without having read the Purgatory and what amounts to his depiction of heaven, because just as the Divine Comedy, as his depiction of Inferno really leaves a great imprint upon our minds, so in reading the other two works, it will leave this very interesting imprint upon our minds, which really served to influence much of the Western tradition and view of heaven, purgatory, and hell.